Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with a story I have mentioned briefly previously, but I think deserves some attention in its wider aesthetic and historical context. Besides, it's a whopping good story. One of you mentioned in the comments in our Greatest Schubert recording section, 5 greatest Schubert recordings, I brought up the Peter Pears Benjamin Britten Winterreise, and one of you acknowledged the greatness of the performance, but just said you couldn't tolerate Peter Pears' particular voice, the voice of what Anna Russell called the strangulated British tenor, of which Pears is the iconic example. There were others he had a major successor in, for example, Robert Tier, he was one of them. It's a strange and local sound, and there are lots of them in the vocal world. There's the Slavonic wobble that you hear in a lot of Eastern European sopranos. That can peel paint in its upper register. There are the German Helden tenors. There's the French soubrette things like Mehdi Mess play. There's just lots of vocal types that don't fall into the normal like soprano, alto, tenor, bass categories. And the strangulated British tenor is one of the most famous. And yes, it's a voice that only somebody from the UK could love, possibly. I think Pears was a fabulous artist. I love it, frankly, and his voice never bothered me, actually. But some people who are trained in, traditional operatic whatevers, take issue with the whole concept. And the story here, and it's a wonderful story that sort of illustrates how these things go on and what the politics is behind voice types of all things, is how Peter Pears wound up in this recording, the Sutherland, Pavarotti, Mehta, Puccini, Turandot, because Peter Pears never appeared, almost never, in Italian opera. His specialty was Lieder, of centuries worth of Lieder, and the works that Benjamin Britten wrote for him. And occasionally he was like in the St. Matthew Passion with Klemperer, did some Bach and other stuff like that. But Italian tenors, no way. Because, the Italian tenor voice, the ideal Italian tenor voice, well, you had Pavarotti. Pavarotti was actually not a heroic tenor. He had a rather small voice. He was a lyric tenor. But you've got, Franco Corelli and people like that. And if you wanted, some more artistic but still heroic tenor type voices, there was Carlo Bergonzi. The Italians had their type of tenor voice. The Germans had their type of tenor voice. And Peter Pears did not fit into any of those categories. And you could certainly not see Peter Pears singing Di quella pira in Il Trovatore. That was just not going to be his thing. So here he is in Turandot. But the role that he got in Turandot was the Emperor Altum. It's a bit part, a tiny, tiny part, a little bit of what they call luxury casting, where you get a big star to do a tiny little part. And the operatic world is full of things like that. You've got, even in the Schulte ring alone, you've got Kirsten Flagstad's Fricka and Joan Sutherland as the Woodbird. And before that, you had Elizabeth Schwarzkopf singing the high C's in the Furtwängler Tristan, because Flagstad's voice wasn't up to the high C anymore, but the rest of it was fine. So she just felt better having someone else take the high C's. There's all kinds of little sniglets like that in the universe of Italian opera. Even in the James Levine Tosca with Renata Scotto, the jailer is sung by Itzhak Perlman. Some people don't notice that, who actually had a lovely baritone voice. So, yeah, it happens for these small roles. Sometimes you get big people or retired people or I saw, what was it, Pique Dame, the Queen of Spades at the Met, where they had Elizabeth Schwarzkopf singing the Countess, who does that one little aria, with whatever voice she had left. So it happens. So that in itself is not so unusual. But this story comes to me from a former Decca executive big major executive at Decca, Remy Farkas by name, who owned a record shop up on Lexington Avenue in his retirement. Orpheus Remarkable Recordings. It was at Lexington Avenue in the 60s. And I used to go there after work constantly. And then he and his buddy, who was from CBS, from Columbia Records, Pierre Bourdain, not Pierre Bourdain, he was he was the chef. But in any case, he and his colleague were together there. They ran this little record store, a boutique record store. And Remy was an Italian opera guy. His greatest point of pride was that he had fired John Culshaw. That was his, he bragged about the fact that he fired John Culshaw. It was the happiest day in his life. He was the brother-in-law of Giuseppe Di Stefano, one of the great Italian tenors and partners of Maria Callas, and he knew and loved Italian opera above all other things. And so he was not, shall we say, simpatico with the concept of the strangulated English tenor. And he was not, I think, involved in the actual production of Turandot. I mean, we have the people here on the list here back in 1972 when that recording came out. But Peter Pears is in it. And the way he tells the story is that Peter Pears had not appeared in almost any Italian opera recording, certainly not for Decca. And they got him to do the Emperor because, and this is the joke, it was an inside joke at Decca. If you look at the score, here is the score to Turandot, and we get to Act 2, part the second half, where we have the riddle scene and all that stuff going on. Oh, let's see, 233. Yes, in the score. Puccini writes for the Emperor in his entrance, when he starts singing Emperor Altum, con voce stanca di vecchio decrepito, which means with the tired voice of a decrepit old man. And so it sounds. He comes in with un giuramento atroce mi costringe. Right? That's the Emperor Altum, a decrepit old voice. Well, in 1972, Peter Pears was, I guess he was 62 actually. I think he was born in 1910. And he was hardly decrepit. I mean, he really wasn't. But the joke, of course, is that, and he could have, he could have diddled his voice to sound decrepit. But of course, according to my friend Remy, he didn't have to. He naturally sounded decrepit. What they figured was they had a guy who had a tenor voice, which the Italian wing at Decca would find absolutely hilarious and absolutely appropriate, because the natural tone of the strangulated British tenor was, by Italian standards, decrepit. I mean, really decrepit. And so they got him, and what they knew from a marketing point of view was that the English musical press would go crazy over having Sir Peter Pears appearing in I don't know if he was a sir then, but Peter Pears appearing in one of his very few Italian opera roles. And sure enough, if you read the reviews of Turandot that came out at that time, this recording, one of its selling points, and the role of the Emperor is 3 lines. It's tiny, teeny tiny role, but that's okay. It was, and in this wonderful bit of luxury casting, Sir Peter Pears agreed to take on the role of the Emperor Altum. I mean, nobody says that the Emperor Altum is near death and is, has the sound of a gross decrepitude, at least as far as fans of Italian opera were concerned. But that's how he got into that Turandot, because his name brought luster to the production as a bit of luxury casting. And the Italian wing at Decca, which was quite annoyed with John Culshaw and all of those people, for their particular tastes, they would never know that the whole thing was a joke. a joke at the expense of the national preference for the strangulated tenor voice. And so there it was, Peter Pears in the Mehta, Sutherland, Pavarotti, Turandot as Emperor Altum. Now, one's preference for vocal timbre is obviously very subjective. I mean, Maria Callas, who is, Maria Callas, has always excited controversy because the voice was not conventionally beautiful. And some people found it to be just atrocious, and others found it to be the most expressive instrument on God's earth. So it's all a matter of taste. It really is. But I just thought this was a lovely, lovely little story that illustrates the national characteristics or national tastes behind some of these things, and also says a lot about the inner workings of the record industry itself and the things that people do. And there's all kinds of stuff that I don't know about, we don't know about, how these things happen the way they happen and what people thought about them at the time. But this is one story I do know about, and so I wanted to share it with you, and I hope you enjoyed it. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me. Take care.